Chapter 6. In the school of political projectors I was but ill entertained, the professors appearing in my judgment wholly out of their senses, which is a scene that never fails to make me melancholy. Those unhappy people were proposing schemes for persuading monarchs to choose favorites upon the score of their wisdom, capacity, and virtue, of teaching ministers to consult the public good, of rewarding merit, great abilities, eminent services, of instructing princes to know their true interest by placing it on the same foundation with that of their people, of choosing for employments persons qualified to exercise them, with many other wild impossible chimeras that never entered before into heart of man to conceive, and confirmed in me the old observation, that there is nothing so extravagant and irrational, which some philosophers have not maintained for truth. But however, I shall so far do justice to this part of the Academy, as to acknowledge that all of them were not so visionary. There was a most ingenious doctor who seemed to be perfectly versed in the whole nature and system of government. This illustrious person had very usefully employed his studies in finding out effectual remedies for all diseases and corruptions, to which the several kinds of public administration are subject by the vices or infirmities of those who govern, as well as the licentiousness of those who are to obey. For instance, whereas all writers and reasoners have agreed that there is a strict universal resemblance between the natural and political body, can there be anything more evident than that the health of both must be preserved and the diseases cured by the same prescriptions? It is allowed that senates and great councils are often troubled with redundant, ebullient, and other peccant humors, with many diseases of the head and more of the heart, with strong convulsions and grievous contradictions of the nerves and sinews in both hands, but especially the right, with spleen, flatus, vertigos, and deliriums, with scrofulous tumors full of fetid virulent matter, with sour frothy irritations, with canine appetites and crudeness of digestion, besides many others needless to mention. This doctor therefore proposed that upon meeting of a senate, certain physicians should attend at the 3 first days of their sitting, and at the close of each day's debate, feel the pulses of every senator, after which, having maturely considered and consulted upon the nature of several maladies, and the methods of cure, they should on the 4th day return to the Senate House, attended by their apothecaries, stored with proper medicines, and before the members sat, administer to each of them lenitives, aperitives, abstersive, corrosives, restringents, palliatives, laxatives, epiphylalgics, iterics, apophlemmatics, acoustics, as their several cases required, and according as these medicines should operate, repeat, alter, or omit them at the next meeting. This project could not be of any great expense to the public, and would, in my poor opinion, be of much use for the dispatch of business in these countries which senates have any share in the legislative power, beget unanimity, shorten debates, and open a few mouths which are now closed, and close many more which are now open, curb the petulancy of the young, and correct the positiveness of the old, rouse the stupid, and damp the pert. Again, because it is a general complaint that the favorites of princes are troubled with short and weak memories, the same doctor proposed that whoever attended the first minister, after having told his business with the utmost brevity and in the plainest words, should at his departure give the said minister a tweak on the nose, or a kick in the belly, or tread on his corns, or lug him thrice by both ears, or run a pin into his breech, or pinch his arm black and blue, to prevent forgetfulness, and at every levee day repeat the same operation, till the business were done or absolutely refused. He likewise directed that every senator in the great council of a nation, after he had delivered his opinion, and argued in the defense of it, should be obliged to give his vote directly contrary, because if that were done, the result would infallibly terminate in the good of the public. When parties in a state are violent, he offered a wonderful contrivance to reconcile them. The method is this: you take 100 leaders of each party, you dispose them into couples of such whose heads are nearest of a size, then let 2 nice operators saw off the occiput of each couple at the same time, in such a manner that the brain may be equally divided. Let the occiputes thus cut off be interchanged, applying each to the head of his opposite party man. It seems indeed to be a work that requireth some exactness, but the professor assured us that if it was dexterously performed, the cure would be infallible. For he argued thus, that the two half-brains, being left to debate the matter between themselves within the space of one skull, would soon come to a good understanding, and produce that moderation, as well as regularity of thinking, so much to be wished for in the heads of those who imagine they come into this world only to watch and govern its motion. And as to the difference of brains in quantity or quality among those who are directors in faction, the doctor assured us from his own knowledge that it was a perfect trifle. I heard a very warm debate between two professors about the most commodious and effectual ways and means of raising money without grieving the subject. The first affirmed the justest method would be to lay certain tax upon vices and folly, and the sum fixed upon every man to be rated after the fairest manner of a jury of his neighbors. The second was of an opinion directly contrary, to tax those quantities of body and mind for which men chiefly value themselves, the rate to be more or less according to the degrees of excelling, the decision whereof should be left entirely to their own breast. The highest tax was upon men who are the greatest favorites of the other sex, and the assessments according to their number and natures of the favors they have received, for which they are allowed to be their own vouchers. Wit, valor, and politeness are likewise proposed to be largely taxed, and collected in the same manner, by every person's giving his own word for the quantum of what he possessed. But as to honor, justice, wisdom, and learning, they should not be taxed at all, because they are qualifications of so singular a kind that no man will either allow them in his neighbor or value them in himself. The women were proposed to be taxed according to their beauty and skill in dressing, wherein they had the same privilege with the men, to be determined by their own judgment, but constancy, chastity, good sense, and good nature were not rated, because they would not bear the charge of collecting. To keep senators in the interest of the crown, it was proposed that the members should raffle for employments, each man first taking an oath and giving security that he would vote for the court, whether he won or no, after which the losers had in their turn the liberty of raffling upon the next vacancy. Thus hope and expectation would be kept alive. None would complain of broken promises, but impute their disappointments wholly to fortune, whose shoulders are broader and stronger than those of a ministry. Another professor showed me a large paper of instructions for discovering plots and conspiracies against the government. The whole discourse was written with great acuteness, concerning many observations both curious and useful for politicians, but I conceive not altogether complete. This I ventured to tell the author, and offered if he pleased to supply him with some additions. He received my proposal with more compliance than is usual among writers, especially those of projecting species, professing he would be glad to receive further information. I told him that in the kingdom of Trebina, by the natives called Langdon, where I had sojourned some time in my travels, the bulk of the people consists in a manner wholly of discoverers, witnesses, informers, accusers, prosecutors, evidences, swearers, together with their several subservient and subaltern instruments, all under the colors and conduct of their ministers of state and their deputies. The plots in that kingdom are usually the workmanship of those persons who desire to raise their own characters of profound politicians, to restore new vigor in a crazy administration, to stifle or divert general discounts, to fill their pockets with forfeitures, and raise or sink the opinion of public credit, as either shall best answer their private advantage. It is first agreed and settled among them what suspected persons shall be accused of a plot. Then effectual care is taken to secure all their letters and papers, and put the criminals in chains. These papers are delivered to a set of artists, very dexterous in finding out the mysteries, meanings of words, syllables, and letters. For instance, they can discover a close stool to signify a privy. Council, a flock of geese, a senate, a lame dog, an invader, a codshed, the plague, a standing army, a buzzard, a prime minister, the gout, a high priest, a gibbet, a secretary of state, a chamber pot a committee of grandees, a sieve a court lady, a broom a revolution, a mousetrap an employment, a bottomless pit the treasury, a sink the court, a cap and bells a favorite, a broken reed a court of justice, an empty turn a general, a running sore the administration. When this method fails, they have two others more effectual. With the learned among them, they call acrostics and anagrams. First, they can decipher all initial letters into political meanings. Thus, capital N shall signify a plot, capital B, a regiment of horse, capital L, a fleet at sea. Or secondly, by transposing the letters of the alphabet in any suspected paper, they can discover the deepest designs of a discontented party. So, for example, if I should say in a letter to a friend, "Our brother Tom has just got the piles," a skillful decipherer would discover that the same letters which compose that sentence may be analyzed into the following words: resist, a plot is brought home, the tour. And this is the anagrammic method. The professor made me great acknowledgments for communicating these observations, and promised to make honorable mention of me in his treatise. I saw nothing in this country that could invite me to a longer continuance, and began to think of returning home to England. Chapter 7. The continent of which this kingdom is part extends itself, as I have reason to believe, eastward to that unknown tract of America, westward of California, and north of the Pacific Ocean, which is not above 150 miles from Lagado, where there is a good port and much commerce with the great island of Lugnag, situated to the northwest about 29 degrees north latitude and 140 longitude. This island of Lugnag stands southeastwards of Japan, about 100 leagues distant. There is a strict allegiance between the Japanese emperor and the king of Lugnag, which affords frequent opportunities of sailing from one island to the other. I determined, therefore, to direct my course this way, in order to my return to Europe. I hired 2 mules with a guide to show me the way, and carry my small baggage. I took leave of my noble protector, who had shown me so much favor and made me a generous present at my departure. My journey was without any accident or adventure worth relating. When I arrived at the port of Maldonada, for so it is called, there was no ship in the harbor bound for Lugnag, nor likely to be in short time. The town is about as large as Portsmouth. I soon fell into some acquaintance, and was very hospitably received. A gentleman of distinction said to me that since the ships bound for Lugnag could not be ready in less than a month, it might be no disagreeable amusement for me to take a trip to the little island of Gulliver, about 5 leagues off to the southwest. He offered himself and a friend to accompany me, and that I should be provided with a small convenient barouche for the voyage. Gulliver, as nearly as I can interpret the word, signifies the island of sorcerers or magicians. It is about 1/3 as large as Isle of Wight, and is extremely fruitful. It is governed by the head of a certain tribe, who are all magicians. This tribe marries only among each other, and the eldest in succession is prince or governor. He hath a noble place, and a park of about 3,000 acres, surrounded by a wall of hewn stone, 20 foot high. In this park are several small enclosures for cattle, corn, and gardening. The governor and his family are served and attended by domestics of a kind of somewhat unusual. By his skill in necromancy, he hath the power of calling whom he pleaseth from the dead, and commanding their service for 24 hours, but no longer. Nor can he call the same persons up again in less than 3 months, except upon very extraordinary occasions. When we arrived at the island, which was about 11 in the morning, one of those gentlemen who accompanied me went to the governor and desired admittance for a stranger, who came on purpose to have the honor of attending on his highness. This was immediately granted, and when we all three entered the gate of the palace between the rows of guards, armed and dressed after a very antic manner, and something in their countenances that made my flesh creep with horror I cannot express. We passed through several apartments between servants of the same sort, ranked on each side as before, till we came to the chamber of presence, where after three profound obeisances and a few general questions, we were permitted to sit on 3 stools near the lowest step of His Highness's throne. He understood the language of Barnibarbi, although it was different from that of this island. He desired me to give him some account of my travels, and to let me see that I should be treated without ceremony. He dismissed all his attendants with a turn of his finger, at which, to my great astonishment, they vanished in an instant, like visions in a dream, when we wake on a sudden. I could not recover myself in some time, till the governor assured me that I should receive no hurt, and observing my 2 companions to be under no concern, who had been often entertained in the same manner, I began to take courage, and related to His Highness a short history of my several adventures, yet now without some hesitation, and frequently looking behind me to the place where I had seen those domestic spectres. I had the honor to dine with the governor, where a new set of ghosts served up the meat, and waited at the table. I now observed myself to be less terrified than I had been in the morning. I stayed till sunset, but humbly desired His Highness to excuse me for not accepting his invitation of lodging in the palace. My 2 friends and I lay at a private house in the town of Jurning, which is the capital of the island, and the next morning we returned to pay our duty to the governor, as he was pleased to command us. After this manner we continued on the island for 10 days, most part of every day with the governor, and at night in our lodging. I soon grew so familiarized with the sight of spirits that after the 3rd or 4th time they gave me no emotion at all, or if I had any apprehensions left, my curiosity prevailed over them. For His Highness the governor ordered me to call up whatever persons I would choose to name, and in whatever numbers among all the dead from beginning of the world to the present time, and command them to answer any questions I should think fit to ask, with this condition that my questions must be confined with the compass of the times they lived in. And one thing I might depend on, that they would certainly tell me truth, for lying was a talent of no use in the lower world. I made my humble acknowledgments to His Highness for so great a favor. We were in a chamber from whence there was a fair prospect in the park, and because my first inclination was to be entertained with scenes of pomp and magnificence, I desired to see Alexander the Great at the head of his army just after the battle of Arbela, which upon a motion of the governor's finger immediately appeared on a large field under the window where we stood. Alexander was called up into the room. It was with great difficulty that I understood his Greek, and had but little of my own. He assured me upon his honor that he was not poisoned, but died of a fever by excessive drinking. Next I saw Hannibal passing the Alps, who told me he had not a drop of vinegar in his camp. I saw Caesar and Pompey at the head of their troops, just ready to engage. I saw the former in his last great triumph. I desired that the Senate of Rome might appear before me in one large chamber, and an assembly of somewhat a latter age in counterview in another. The first seemed to be an assembly of heroes and demigods, the other a knot of peddlers, pickpockets, and highwaymen and bullies. The governor, at my request, gave the sign for Caesar and Brutus to advance towards us. I was struck with a profound veneration of the sight of Brutus, who could easily discover the most consummate virtue, the greatest intrepidity and firmness of mind, the truest love of his country, and general benevolence for mankind in every lineament of his countenance. I observed with much pleasure that these 2 persons were in good intelligence with each other, and Caesar freely confessed to me that the greatest acquisitions of his own life were not equal by many degrees to the glory of taking it away. I had the honor to have much conversation with Brutus, and was told that his ancestor Junus, Socrates, and Epaminondas, Cato the Younger, Sir Thomas More, and himself were perpetually together. A sex and virtue to all the ages of the world cannot add a 7th. It would be tedious to trouble the reader with relating the vast numbers of illustrious persons were called up. To gratify that insatiable desire, I had to see the world in every period of antiquity placed before me. I chiefly fed my eyes with beholding the destroyers of tyrants and usurpers, and the restorers of liberty to oppressed and injured nations. But it is impossible to express the satisfaction I received in my own mind after such a manner as to make it a suitable environment to the reader. Chapter 8. Having the desire to see those ancients who were most renowned for wit and learning, I set apart one day on purpose. I proposed that Homer and Aristotle might appear at the head of all their commentators. but those were so numerous that some hundreds were forced to attend in the court and outward rooms of the palace. I knew and could distinguish those two heroes at first sight, not only from the crowd but from each other. Homer was the taller and comelier person of the two, walked very erect for one of his age, and his eyes were the most quick and piercing I ever beheld. Aristotle stooped much, and made use of his staff. His visage was meagre, his hair lank and thin, and his voice hollow. I soon discovered that both of them were perfect strangers to the rest of the company, and had never seen or heard of them before. And I had a whisper from a ghost, who still be nameless, that these commentators always kept in the most distant quarters from their principals in the lower world, through a consciousness of shame and guilt, because they had so horribly misrepresented the meaning of those authors to posterity. They introduced Didymus and Eusthathius to Homer, and prevailed on him to treat them better than perhaps they deserved, for he soon found they wanted a genius to enter the spirit of a poet. But Aristotle was out of all patience with the account I gave him of Scotus and Ramos, as I presented them to him, and he asked them whether the rest of the tribe were as great dunces as themselves. I then desired the governor to call up Descartes and Cassandini, with whom I prevailed to explain their systems to Aristotle. This great philosopher freely acknowledged his own mistakes in natural philosophy, because he proceeded in many things upon conjecture, as all men must do, and he found that Gassendi, who had made the doctrine of Epicurus as palatable as he could, and the vortices of Descartes were equally exploded. He predicted the same fate to attraction, whereof the present learned are such zealots assertors. He said that new systems of nature were but new fashions, which would vary in every age, and even those who pretend to demonstrate them from mathematical principles would flourish but a short period of time, and be out of vogue when that was determined. I spent 5 days in conversing with many others of the ancient learned. I saw most of the first Roman emperors. I prevailed on the governor to call up Heliogabalus, cooks to dress up a dinner, but they could not show us much by their skill for want of materials. A helot of Agesilaus made us a dish of Spartan broth, but I was not able to get down a second spoonful. The two gentlemen who conducted me to their island were pressed by their private affairs to return in 3 days, which I employed in seeing some of the modern dead, who had made the greatest figure for 200 or 300 years past in their own and other countries of Europe. And having always a great admirer of all illustrious families, I desired the governor would call up a dozen or two of kings with their ancestors in order for 8 or 9 generations. But my disappointment was grievous and unexpected, for instead of a long train with royal diadems, I saw in one family 2 fiddlers, 3 spruce courtiers, and an Italian prelate; in another a barber, an abbot, and 2 cardinals. I have too great a veneration for crowned heads to dwell any longer on so nice a subject. But as to courts, marquesses, dukes, earls, and the like, I was not so scrupulous, and I confess it was not without some pleasure that I found myself able to trace the particular features by which certain families are distinguished, up to their originals. I could plainly discover them from whence one family derives a long chain, why a second hath abounded with knaves for 2 generations, and fools for 2 more, why a third happened to be crack-brained, and a fourth to be sharpers, whence it came to what Polydore Virgil says of a certain great house, Nec vir fortis, nec fimta casta, how cruelty, falsehood, and cowardice grew to be characteristics by which certain families are distinguished, as much as by their coat of arms, who first brought the pox into a noble house, which hath lineally descended in scrofulous tumors to their posterity. Neither could I wonder at all this when I saw such an interpretation of lineages by pages, lackeys, valets, coachmen, gamesters, captains, and pickpockets. I was chiefly disgusted with modern history, for having strictly examined all the persons of great name and the courts of princes for 100 years past, I found how the world had been misled by prostitute writers to ascribe the greatest exploits in war to cowards, the wisest counsel to fools, sincerity to flatterers, Roman virtue to betrayers of their country, piety to atheists, chastity to sodomites, truth to informers. How many innocent and excellent persons have been condemned to death or banishments by the practicing of great ministers upon the corruption of judges and the malice of factions? How many villains have been exalted to the highest places of trust, power, dignity, and profit? How great a share in the motions and events of courts, councils, and senates might be challenged by parasites and buffoons? How low an opinion I had of human wisdom and integrity, when I was truly informed of the springs and motives of great enterprises and revolutions in the world, and of the contemptible accidents to which they owed their success. Here I discovered the roguery and ignorance of those who pretend to write anecdotes or secret history, who send so many kings to their graves with a cup of poison, will repeat the discourse between the prince and chief minister, where no witness was by, unlock the thoughts and cabinets of ambassadors and secretaries of state, and have the perpetual misfortune to be mistaken. Here I discovered the secret cases of many great events that have surprised the world, how the black stairs can govern a council, and the council a senate. A general confessed in my presence that he got a victory purely by the force of cowardice and ill conduct, and an admiral that for want of proper intelligence he beat the enemy to whom he intended to betray the fleet. 3 kings protested to me that in their whole reigns they never did once prefer any person of merit, unless by mistake or treachery of some minister in whom they confided. Neither would they do it if they were to live again, and they showed with great strength of reason that the royal throne could not be supported without corruption, because that positive, confident, restive temper which virtue infused into man was a perpetual clog to public business. I had the curiosity to inquire in a particular manner by what method great numbers had procured to themselves high titles of honor and prodigious estates, and I confined my inquiry to very modern period, however, without grating upon present times, because I would be sure to give no offense even to foreigners. For I hope the reader need not be told that I do not in the least intend my own country in what I say upon this occasion. A great number of persons concerned were called up, and upon a very slight examination discovered such a scene of infamy that I cannot reflect upon it without some seriousness. Perjury, oppression, subordination, fraud, panderism, and the like infirmaries were amongst the most excusable arts they had to mention, and for them I gave, as it was reasonable, great allowance. But when some confessed they owed their greatness and wealth to the betraying of their country or their prince, some of poisoning, more to the preventing of justice in order to destroy the innocent, I hope I may be pardoned if these discoveries inclined me a little to abate of that profound veneration, which I am naturally apt to pay to persons of high rank, who ought to be treated with the utmost respect due to their sublime dignity by us, their inferiors. I had often read of some great services done to princes and states, and desired to see the persons by whom these services were performed. Upon inquiry, I was told that their names were to be found on no record, except a few of them whom history had represented as the vilest rogues and traitors. As to the rest, I had never once heard of them. They all appeared with dejected looks and in the meanest habit, most of them telling me they died in poverty and disgrace, and the rest on a scaffold or a gibbet. Among the rest there was one person whose case appeared a little singular. He had a youth about 18 years old standing by his side. He told me he had for many years been a commander of a ship, and in the sea fight at Actium had the good fortune to break through the enemy's great line of battle, sink 3 of their capital ships, and take a 4th, which was the sole cause of Antony's fight, and of the victory that ensued. That the youth standing by him, his only son, was killed in the action. He added that upon the confidence of some merit, the war being at an end, he went to Rome and solicited the court of Augustus to be preferred to a greater ship, whose commander had been killed, but without any regard to his pretensions. It was given to a youth who had never seen the sea, the son of Libertina, who waited on one of the emperor's mistresses. Returning back to his own vessel, he was charged with neglect of duty, and the ship given to a favorite page of Publicola, the vice-admiral. whereupon he retired to a poor farm at a great distance from Rome, and there ended his life. I was so curious to know the truth of this story that I desired Agrippa might be called, who was the admiral in that fight. He appeared and confirmed the whole account, but with much more advantage to the captain, whose modesty had extenuated or concealed a great part of his merit. I was surprised to find corruption grown so high and so quick in the empire. By the force of luxury so lately introduced, which made me wonder at many parallel cases in other countries where vices of all kinds have reigned so much longer, and where the whole praise as well as pillage hath been engrossed by the chief commander, who perhaps the least title to either. As every person called up made exactly the same appearance he had done in the world, it gave me melancholy reflections to observe how much the race of humankind was degenerate among us, with those 100 years past. How the pox, under all its consequences and denominations, had altered every lineament of English countenance, shortened the size of bodies, embraced the nerves, relaxed the sinews and muscles, introduced a sallow complexion, and rendered the flesh loose and rancid. I descended so low as to desire that some English yeomen of the old stamp might be summoned to appear, once so famous for the simplicity of their manners, diet, and dress, for justice in their dealings, for their true spirit of liberty, for their valor and love of their country. Neither could I be wholly unmoved after comparing the living with the dead. When I considered how all these pure native virtues were prostituted for a piece of money by their grandchildren, who in selling their votes and mangling at elections, have acquired every vice and corruption that could possibly be learned in court. Chapter 9. The day of our departure being come, I took leave of His Highness the Governor of Gulliver, and returned with my 2 companions to Maladonada, where after a fortnight's waiting a ship was ready to sail for Luggnagg. The 2 gentlemen and some others were so generous and kind as to furnish me with provisions, and see me on board. I was a month in this voyage. We had one violent storm, and were under a necessary of steering westward to get into the trade wind, which holds for above 60 leagues. On the 21st of April, 1709, we sailed into the river of Clumegnig, which is a seaport town. At the southeast port of Luggnagg, we cast anchor within a league of the town, and made a signal for the pilot. 2 of them came on board in less than half an hour, by whom we were guided between certain shoals and rocks, which are very dangerous in the passage, to a large basin, where a fleet may ride in safety within a cable's length of the town wall. Some of our sailors, whether out of treachery or inadvertence, had informed the pilots that I was a stranger and a great traveler, whereof these gave notice to a custom-house officer, by whom I was examined very strictly upon my landing. This officer spoke to me in the language of Bilnibarbi, which by the force of much commerce is generally understood in that town, especially by seamen and those employed in the customs. I gave him a short account of some particulars, and made my story as plausible and consistent as I could. But I thought it necessary to disguise my country and call myself a Hollander, because my intentions were for Japan, and I knew that Dutch were the only Europeans permitted to enter into that kingdom. I therefore told the officer that having been shipwrecked on the coast of Balnibarbi and cast upon a rock, I was received up into Laputa, or the Flying Island, of which he had often heard, and was now endeavoring to get to Japan, from whence I might find a convenience of returning to my own country. The officer said I must be confined till he could receive orders from court, for which he would write immediately, and hoped to receive an answer in a fortnight. I was carried to a convenient lodging, with a sentry place at the door. However, I had the liberty of a large garden, and was treated with humanity enough, being maintained all the time at the king's charge. I was visited by several persons, chiefly out of curiosity, because it was reported that I came from countries very remote, of which they had never heard. I hired a young man to come in the same ship to be an interpreter. He was a native of Luggnagg, but had lived some years at Maladonada, and was perfect master of both languages. By his assistance I was able to hold a conversation with those who came to visit me, but this consisted only of their questions and my answers. Dispatch came from court about the time we expected. It contained a warrant for conducting me and my retinue to Traldragdub, or Trildrogdrib, for it is pronounced both ways as near as I can remember. by a party of 10 horse. All my retinue was that poor lad for all interpreter, whom I persuaded into my service, and at my humble request we had each of us a mule to ride on. A messenger was dispatched half a day's journey before us, to give the king notice of my approach, and to desire that his majesty would please to appoint a day and hour, when it would be his gracious pleasure that I might be in honor to lick the dust before his footstool. This is the court style, and I found it to be more than a matter of form. For upon my admittance 2 days after my arrival, I was commanded to crawl on my belly and lick the floor as I advanced, but on account of my being a stranger, care was taken to have it made so clean that the dust was not offensive. However, this was a particular grace not allowed to any persons of the highest rank, when they desired admittance. Nay, sometimes the floor is strewed with dust on purpose, when the person to be admitted happens to have powerful enemies at court. And I have seen a great lord with his mouth so crammed that when he had crept to the proper distance from the throne, he was not able to speak a word. Neither is there any remedy, because it is capital for those who receive an audience to spit or wipe their mouths in his majesty's presence. There is indeed another custom which I cannot altogether approve of. When the king hath a mind to put any of his nobles to death in a gentle, indulgent manner, he commands to have the floor strowed with a certain brown powder, of a deadly composition, which being licked up infallibly kills him in 24 hours. But in justice to his prince's great clemency, and the care he hath of his subjects' lives, wherein it were much to be wished that the monarchs of Europe would imitate him, it must be mentioned for his honor that strict orders are given to have the infected parts of the floor well washed after such execution, which if his domestics neglect, they are in danger of incurring his royal displeasure. I myself heard him give directions that one of the pages should be whipped, whose turn it was to give notice about washing the floor after an execution, but maliciously had omitted it, by which neglect a young lord of great hopes coming to an audience was unfortunately poisoned, although the king at that time had no design against his life. But this good prince was so gracious to forgive the poor page his whipping, upon the promise that he would do so no more, without special orders. To return from this digression, when I had crept within 4 yards of the throne, I raised myself gently upon my knees, and then striking my forehead 7 times on the ground, I pronounced the following words as they had been taught me the night before. Ekpling Glothothrob Squetserum Bilhirp Blashnalt Swain Tnodbach Gluff Schliphad Gurtlable Asht. This is the complement established by the laws of the land for all persons admitted to the king's presence. It may be rendered into English thus: May your celestial majesty outlive the sun 11 moons and a half. To this the king returned some answer, which although I could not understand, yet I replied as I had been directed. Fluffdrin Yalric Duldum Prastrad Mirpush, which properly signifies, my tongue is in the mouth of my friend. And by this expression was meant that I desired to leave to bring my interpreter, whereupon the young man already mentioned was accordingly introduced, by whose intervention I answered as many questions as his majesty could put out in above an hour. I spoke in the Balnibarian tongue, and my interpreter delivered my meaning in that of Lugnag. The king was much delighted with my company, and ordered his Blif Marklub, or High Chamberlain, to appoint a lodging in the court for me and my interpreter, with a daily allowance for my table, and a large purse of gold for my common expenses. I stayed 3 months in this country out of perfect obedience to his majesty, who was pleased highly to favor me, and made me very honorable offers, but I thought it was more consistent with prudence and justice to pass the remainder of my days with my wife and family. Chapter 10. The Lugnagians are a polite and generous people, and although they are not without some share of that pride which is peculiar to all eastern countries, yet they show themselves courteous to strangers, especially such who are countenanced by the court. I had many acquaintance among persons of the best fashion, and being always attended by my interpreter, the conversation we had was not disagreeable. One day, in much good company, I was asked by a person of quality whether I had seen any of their Struttelbergs or immortals. I said I had not, and desired he would explain to me what he meant by such an appellation. Applied to a mortal creature. He told me that sometimes, although very rarely, a child happened to be born in a family with a red circular spot in the forehead, directly over its left eyebrow, which was an infallible mark that it should never die. That spot, as he described it, was about the compass of a silver threepence, but in the course of time grew larger and changed its color. For 12 years old it became green, so continued till 25. Then it turned to a deep blue. At 45 it grew coal black, and as large as an English shilling, but never admitted to any further alteration. He said these births were so rare that he did not believe there could be above 1,100 Struttelbergs of both sexes in the whole kingdom, of which he computed about 50 in the metropolis, and among the rest a young girl born about 3 years ago. That these productions were not peculiar to any family, but a mere effect of chance, and the children of Struttelbergs themselves were equally mortal with the rest of the people. I freely own myself to have been struck with an inexpressible delight upon hearing this account, and the person who gave it to me happening to understanding the Balnebarbian language, which I spoke very well, I could not forbear breaking out into expressions perhaps a little too extravagant. I cried out, as in rapture, "Happy nation, where every child hath at least a chance for being immortal. Happy people who enjoy so many living examples of ancient virtue, and have masters ready to instruct them in the wisdom of all former ages. But happiest beyond all comparison are those excellent Strulbergs, who being born exempt from the universal calamity of human nature, have their minds free and disengaged without the weight and depression of spirits caused by the continual apprehension of death." I discovered my admiration that I had not observed any of these illustrious persons at court, the black spot on the forehead being so remarkable a distinction that I could not have easily overlooked it, and it was impossible that His Majesty, a most judicious prince, should not provide himself with a good number of such wise and able counselors. Yet perhaps the virtue of those revered sages was too strict for the corrupt and libertine manners of court, and we often find by experience that young men are too opinionative and volatile to be guided by the sober dictates of their seniors. However, since the king was pleased to allow me access to his royal person, I was resolved upon the very first occasion to deliver my opinion to him on this matter freely and at large, by the help of my interpreter, and whether he would please take my advice or no. Yet in one thing I was determined, that His Majesty having frequently offered me an establishment in this country, I would with great thankfulness accept the favor, and pass my life here in the conversation of those superior beings, the Struttelbergs, if they would please to admit me. The gentleman to whom I addressed my discourse, because, as I have already observed, he spoke the language of the Balnebarbi, said to me with a sort of smile, which usually ariseth from pity to the ignorant, and he was glad of any occasion to keep me among them, and desired my permission to explain to the company what I had spoke. He did so, and they talked together for some time in their own language, whereof I understood not a syllable, neither could I observe by their countenances what impression my discourse had made on them. After a short silence, the same person told me that his friends and mine, so he thought fit to express himself, were very much pleased with the judicious remarks I had made on the great happiness and advantages of immortal life, and they were desirous to know in a particular manner what scheme of living I should have formed to myself if it had fallen to my lot to have borne a Struttelberg. I answered it was easy to be so eloquent on so copious and delightful a subject, especially to me, who have been often apt to amuse myself with visions of what I should do if I were a king, a general, or a great lord. And upon this very case I had frequently run over a whole system how I should employ myself and pass the time if I were sure to live forever. That if it had been my good fortune to come across the world as a Struttelberg, as soon as I could discover my own happiness by understanding the difference between life and death, I would first resolve by all arts and methods whatsoever to procure myself riches, in the pursuit of which my thrift and management I might reasonably expect in about 200 years to be the wealthiest man in the kingdom. In the second place, I would from my earliest youth apply myself to the study of arts and sciences, by which I should arrive in time to excel all others in learning. Lastly, I would carefully record every action and event of consequence that happened in the public, impartially draw the characters of several successions of princes and great ministers of state, with my own observations on every point. I would exactly set down the several changes in customs, language, fashions of dress, diet, and diversions, by all which acquirements I should be a living treasury of knowledge and wisdom, and certainly become the oracle of the nation. I would never marry after 60, but live in a hospitable manner. Yet still, on the saving side, I would entertain myself in forming and directing the minds of hopeful young men, by convincing them from my own remembrance, experience, and observation, fortified by numerous examples of the usefulness of virtue in public and private life. But my choice and consultant companions should be a set of my own immortal brotherhood, among whom I would elect a dozen from the most ancient down to my own contemporaries. Where any of these wanted fortunes, I would provide them with convenient lodges round my own estate, and have some of them always at my table, only mingling a few of the most valuable among you mortals, whom length of time would harden me to lose with little or no reluctance, and treat your posterity after the same manner, just as a man diverts himself with annual successions of pinks and tulips in his garden, without regretting the loss of those which withered the preceding year. The Strelbergs and I would mutually communicate our observations and memorials through the course of time, remark the several graduations by which corruption steals into the world, and oppose it in every step, by giving perpetual warning and instruction to mankind, which, added to the strong influence of our own example, would probably prevent the continual degeneracy of human nature, so justly compiled of in all the ages. Add to all this the pleasure of seeing the various revolutions of states and empires, the changes in the lower and upper world, ancient cities in ruins, and obscure villages become the seats of kings, famous rivers lessening into shallow brooks, the ocean leaving one coast dry and overwhelming another, the discovery of many countries yet unknown, barbarity overrunning the politest nations, and the most barbarous becoming civilized. I should then see the discovery of the longitude and perpetual motion, the universal medicine, and many other great inventions brought to the utmost perfection. What wonderful discoveries should we make in astronomy by outliving and confirming our own predictions, by observing the progress and returns of comets, with the changes of motion in the sun, moon, and stars. I enlarged upon many other topics which the natural desire of endless life and sublunary happiness could easily furnish me with. When I had ended, the sum of my discourse had been interpreted, as before, to the rest of the company. There was a good deal of talk among them in the language of the country, not without some laughter at my expense. At last the same gentleman who had been my interpreter said he was desired by the rest to set me right in a few mistakes which I had fallen into through the common imbecility of human nature, and upon that allowance was less answerable for them. That this breed of Strelbergs was particular to their country, for there was no such people either in Balnibarbi or Japan, where he had the honor to be ambassador for his majesty, and found the natives of both these kingdoms were hard to believe that the fact was possible, and it appeared from my astonishment when he first mentioned the matter to me that I received it as a thing wholly new and sacred to be credited. That in these two kingdoms above mentioned, where during his residence he had conversed very much, he observed long life to be the universal desire and wish of mankind, that whoever had one foot in the grave was sure to hold back the other as strongly as he could. The oldest had still hopes of living one day longer, and looked on death as the greatest evil, from which nature always prompted him to retreat. Only in this island of Lugnag the appetite for living was not so eager, from the continual example of the Strelbergs before their eyes. That the system of living contrived by me was unreasonable and unjust, because it supposed a perpetuity of youth, health, and vigor, which no man could be so foolish to hope, however extravagant he may be in his wishes. That the question therefore was not whether a man would choose to be always in the prime of his youth, attended with prosperity and health, but how he would pass a perpetual life under all the usual disadvantages which old age brings along with it. For although few men will avow their desires of being immortal upon such hard conditions, yet in the two kingdoms before mentioned of Barnaby and Japan, he observed that every man desired to put off death for some time longer, let it approach ever so late, and he rarely heard of any man who died willingly, except he were incited by the extremity of grief or torture. And he appealed to me whether in those countries I had traveled as well as my own, I had not observed the same general disposition. After this preface, he gave me a particular account of the Struttelbergs among them. He said they commonly acted like mortals till about 30 years old, after which by degrees they grew melancholy and dejected, increasing in both till they came to the fourscore. This he learned from their own confession, for otherwise there not being above 2 or 3 of that species bore in an age, they were too few to form a general observation by. When they came to 80 years, which is reckoned the extremity of living in this country, they had not only all the follies and infirmaries of other old men, but many more which arose from the dreadful prospect of never dying. They were not only opinionative, peevish, covetous, morose, vain, talkative, but incapable of friendship, and dead to all natural affection, which never descended below their grandchildren. Envy and impotent desires are their prevailing passions, but those objects against which their envy seems principally directed are the vices of the younger sort, and the deaths of the old. By reflecting on the former, they find themselves cut off from all possibility of pleasure, and whenever they see a funeral, they lament and repine that others have gone to the harbor of rest, to which they themselves can never hope to arrive. They have no remembrance of anything but what they learned and observed in their youth and middle age, and even that is very imperfect. And for the truth or particulars of any fact, it is safer to depend on common traditions than their best recollections. The least miserable among them appear to be those who turn to dotage and entirely lose their memories. These meet with more pity and assistance because they want many bad qualities which abound in others. If Strulberg happened to marry one of his own kind, the marriage is dissolved, of course, by the courtesy of the kingdom, as soon as the younger of the two comes to be fourscore, for the law thinks it a reasonable indulgence that those who are condemned without any fault of their own to a perpetual continuance in the world should not have their misery doubled by the load of a wife. As soon as they have completed the term of 80 years, they are looked on as dead in law. Their heirs immediately succeed to their estates, only a small pittance is reserved for their support, and the poor ones are maintained at the public charge. After that period, they are held incapable of any employment of trust or profit. They cannot purchase lands or take leases, neither are they allowed to be witnesses in any cause, either civil or criminal, not even for the decision of meres and bounds. At 90 they lose their teeth and hair, and they have at the age no distinction of taste, but eat and drink whatever they can get, without relish or appetite. The diseases they were subject to still continue without increasing or diminishing. In talking, they forget the common appellation of things and the names of persons, even of those who are their nearest friends and relations. For the same reason, they can never amuse themselves with reading, because their memory will not serve to carry them from the beginning of a sentence to the end. And by this defect they are deprived of the only entertainment whereof they might otherwise be capable. The language of this country being always upon the flux, the Struttelbergs of one age do not understand those of another. Neither are they able after 200 years to hold any conversation, farther than by a few general words, with their neighbors the mortals, and thus they lie under the disadvantage of living like foreigners in their own country. This was the account given to me of the Struttelbergs, as near as I can remember. I afterwards saw 5 or 6 of different ages, the youngest not above 200 years old, who were brought to me at several times by some of my friends. But although they were told that I was a great traveler and had seen all the world, they had not the least curiosity to ask me a question, only desired that I would give them slumskadask, or a token of remembrance, which is a modest way of begging to avoid the law that strictly forbids it, because they are provided for by the public, although indeed with a very scanty allowance. They are despised and hated by all sorts of people. When one of them is born, it is reckoned ominous, and their birth is recorded very particularly, so that you may know their age by consulting the registry, which, however, hath not been kept above 1,000 years past, or at least hath been destroyed by time or public disturbances. But the usual way of computing how old they are is by asking them what kings or great persons they can remember, and in consulting history, for infallibly the last prince in their mind did not begin his reign after they were 80 years old. They were the most mortifying sight I ever beheld, and the women were more horrible than the men. Besides the usual deformities in extreme old age, they acquired an additional ghastliness in proportion to the number of years, which is not to be described, and among half a dozen I soon distinguished which was the eldest, although there was not above a century or two between them. The reader will easily believe that from what I had heard and seen, my keen appetite for perpetuity of life was much abated. I grew heartily ashamed of the pleasing visions I had formed. I thought no tyrant could invent a death into which I would not run with pleasure from such a life. The king heard of all that had passed between me and my friends upon this occasion, and rallied me very pleasantly, wishing I could send a couple of Strelbergs to my own country, to arm our people against the fear of death. But this, it seems, is forbidden by the fundamental laws of the kingdom, or else I should have been well content with the trouble and expense of transporting them. I could not but agree with the laws of this kingdom relating to the Strelbergs, were founded upon the strongest reasons, and such as any country would be under the necessity of enacting in the like circumstances. Otherwise, as avarice is the necessary consequence of old age, these immortals would in time become proprietors of the whole nation, and engross their civil power, which, for want of abilities to manage, must end in the ruin of the public. Chapter 11. I thought this account of the Strelbergs might be some entertainment to the reader, because it seems to be a little out of the common way. At least I do not remember to have met the like in any book of travels that hath come to my hands. And if I am deceived, my excuse must be that it is necessary for travelers, who describe the same country, very often to agree in dwelling on the same particulars without deserving the censure of having borrowed or transcribed from those who wrote before them. There is indeed a perpetual commerce between this kingdom and the great empire of Japan, and it is very profitable that the Japanese authors may have given some account of the Strelbergs, but my stay in Japan was so short that I was entirely a stranger to that language, that I was not qualified to make any inquiries. But I hope the Dutch, upon this notice, will be curious and able enough to supply my defects. His Majesty, having often pressed me to accept some employment in his court, and finding me absolutely determined to return to my native country, was pleased to give me his license to depart, and honored me with a letter of recommendation under his own hand to the Emperor of Japan. He likewise presented me with 444 large pieces of gold, this nation delighting in even numbers, and a red diamond which I sold in England for 1,100 pounds. On the 6th day of May, 1709, I took a solemn leave of His Majesty and all my friends. This prince was so gracious as to order a guard to conduct me to Llanguenstald, which is a royal port to the southwest part of the island. In 6 days I found a vessel ready to carry me to Japan, and spent 15 days in the voyage. We landed at a small port town called Zamashi, situated on the southeast part of Japan. The town lies on the western point, where there is a narrow strait leading northward into a long arm of the sea, upon the northwest part of which Yedo, the metropolis, stands. At landing, I showed the custom house officers my letter from the King of Lugnag to His Imperial Majesty. They knew the seal perfectly well. It was as broad as the palm of my hand. The impression was a king lifting up a lame beggar from the earth. The magistrates of the town, hearing of my letter, received me as a public minister. They provided me with carriages and servants, and bore my charges to Yedo, where I was admitted to an audience, and delivered my letter, which was opened with great ceremony, and explained to the emperor by an interpreter, who then gave me notice by His Majesty's order that I should signify my request, and, whatever it were, it should be granted for the sake of his royal brother of Lugnag. This interpreter was a person employed to transact affairs with the Hollanders. He soon conjectured by my countenance that I was a European, and therefore repeated His Majesty's commands in Low Dutch, which he spoke perfectly well. I answered, as I had before determined, that I was a Dutch merchant, shipwrecked in a very remote country, from whence I travelled by sea to the land of Lugnag, and then took shipping for Japan, where I knew my countrymen often traded, and with some of these I hoped to get an opportunity of returning to Europe. I therefore most humbly entreated his royal favour to give order that I should be conducted to safety to Nagasaki. To this I added another petition, that for the sake of my patron, the King of Lugnag, His Majesty would consent to excuse my performing the ceremony imposed on my countrymen, of trampling upon the crucifix, because I had been thrown into his kingdom by my misfortunes, without any intention of trading. When this latter petition was interpreted to the emperor, he seemed a little surprised, and said he believed I was the first of my countrymen who ever made any scruple in this point, and that he began to doubt whether I was a real Hollander or no, but rather suspected I must be a Christian. However, for the reasons I had offered, but chiefly to gratify the King of Lugnag by an uncommon mark of his favour, he would comply with the singularity of my humour. But the affair must be managed with dexterity, and his officers should be commanded to let me pass, as it were by forgetfulness. For he assured me that if the secret should be discovered of my countrymen Dutch, they would cut my throat in the voyage. I returned my thanks by interpreter for so unusual a favour, and some troops being at the time on their march to Nagasaki, the commanding officer had orders to convey me safe thither, with particular instructions on the business of the crucifix. On the 9th day of June, 1709, I arrived at Nagasaki, after a very long and troublesome journey. I soon fell into the company of some Dutch sailors belonging to the Embayana of Amsterdam, a stout ship of 450 tons. I had lived long in Holland, pursuing my studies at Leyden, and I spoke Dutch well. The seamen soon knew from whence I came last. They were curious to inquire unto my voyages and course of life. I made up a story as short and probable as I could, but concealed the greatest part. I knew many persons in Holland. I was able to invent names for my parents, whom I pretended to be obscure people in the province of Gelderland. I would have given the captain, one Thierry Vengrold, what he pleased to ask for my voyage to Holland, but understanding I was a surgeon, he contented to take half the usual rate, on condition I would serve him in the way of my calling. Before we took shipping, I was often asked by some of the crew whether I had performed the ceremony above mentioned. I evaded the question by general answers, that I had satisfied the emperor and court in all particulars. However, a malicious rogue of a skipper went to an officer and pointed to me, told him I had not yet trampled on the crucifix, but the other, who had received instructions to let me pass, gave the rascal 20 strokes on the shoulders with a bamboo, after which I was no more troubled with such questions. Nothing happened worth mentioning in this voyage. We sailed with a fair wind to the Cape of Good Hope, where we stayed only to take in fresh water. On the 10th of April we arrived safe at Amsterdam, having lost only 3 men by sickness in the voyage, and a 4th who fell from the foremast into the sea, not far from the coast of Guinea. From Amsterdam I soon set sail for England in a small vessel belonging to that city. On the 16th of April, 1710, we put in at the Downs. I landed the next morning and saw once more my native country, after an absence of 5 years and 6 months complete. I went straight to Redriff, where I arrived the same day at 2 in the afternoon, and found my wife and family in good health.